Did it pop up saying it was recording?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So welcome to our second webinar session of the academic year, featuring Dr. Diane Larsen-Freeman. My name is Allie Holmes, and I'm a doctoral candidate at Purdue University and the Senior Graduate Student Representative for the Complexity Theories in Education, SIG. Today, we welcome Dr. Diane Larsen-Freeman. Diane Larsen-Freeman received her Ph.D. in linguistics from the University of Michigan. She presently is a Professor Emerita of Education and of Linguistics, research scientist, and former director of the English Language Institute at the University of Michigan. She is also a Professor Emerita at the SIT Graduate Institute in Vermont and a visiting faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania. Among the many books that she has authored, the most relevant to this webinar is her 2003 volume, Teaching Language from Grammar to Grammaring, and her 2008 book with Lynne Cameron, Complex Systems and Applied Linguistics, winner of the Modern Language Association's Kenneth Mildenberger Book Prize. Also likely of interest to this audience is her co-editing of a special issue of the International Journal of Complexity in Education in 2003. Dr. Diane Larsen-Freeman has been a speaker in over 70 countries around the world. She has edited the Journal of Language Learning for 5 years, and she later served as the chair of its board of directors. She has also received the American Associations of Applied Linguistics highest honor, its Distinguished Scholarship and Service Award. Last year, she was included as a fellow into the International Cognitive Science Society at a ceremony in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Diane will deliver her presentation. Sorry. Due to the richness of the presentation, we might not have the opportunity for a Q&A. However, we definitely hope to. So please join me in welcoming Diane as she discusses complex dynamic systems theory and second language development.
How is that? Can you see okay, everyone?
Yes.
We're good.
Good, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I consider this SIG to be very important, complexity theory to be very important, and I'll make a case for it as I go along, although probably I'm preaching to the choir. So I'm going to assume, though, that, excuse me, just 1 second. Why is this not? There we go. I'm going to assume that this audience as a whole don't all know about language or language development. And therefore, I'm going to do something that I hope helps the newcomers and doesn't leave the other folks back, left out. Sorry. What's happening here?
The slides aren't advancing.
Right. And that's because, why is that because? Sorry. This is what I don't need. We just tested this out. Why is this doing this?
The pleasures of Zoom sometimes.
Yeah. Okay, we can see the slideshow. Yes, okay. It advances right now. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So as an introduction, and it's text heavy, but I'll take you through it. complex dynamic systems theory, or I'll refer to it as CDST, has been recognized as an important meta theory. And I know those of you from Temple will say, no, that's Willis Overton, and Lynne Cameron and I talked about it as a supra-disciplinary theory. But Jan Holstein talks about, credits it as a meta, or he gets credit for talking about it as a meta theory applicable to second language development. It enables us to study principles and mechanisms of change in SLD, second language development. As such, CDST has been recognized as a framework to account for the dynamic process of second language development, providing substantive contributions to the field. Okay, what about the promise of complex systems in my field? I see complex dynamic systems theory contributing to a new post-structural theme. It cuts across many areas in linguistics, applied linguistics. It transforms our objects of concern, language in our case, into processes and puts change and dynamic systems at the forefront of our investigations of language learning development. It inspires a different way to think about language teaching. And I say this is an outline because I'm going to take those in turn: language learning or language learning development, and language teaching. Oh boy. Sorry, did that just jump on you?
It zoomed in.
Okay. So let's start with what is language. As Jonan in last month's excellent presentation for this SIG said, really what we're all looking at is language, right? But we need to start by talking about what it is. And in fact, it's been defined in various ways as a genetic inheritance, a mathematical system, a social fact, the expression of individual identity, the expression of cultural identity, the outcome of dialogical interactions, a social semiotic, the intuitions of native speakers, the sum of attested data, a collection of memorized chunks, things like how are you, a rule-governed, discrete combinatorial system, or electrical activation in a distributed network. So over the years, we've had many different definitions. Certainly one of them has been resulting from the cognitive revolution, something called universal grammar, a generative grammar, because it generates language, it generates sentences. And of course, the name most closely associated with this view is Noam Chomsky, although UG has had many versions. But basically underlying them all is the idea of a universal grammar. Universal grammar, or UG, is needed to address the logical problem. And the logical problem goes like this: how is it possible that children all over the world can acquire their language to the extent that they can at an early age, where we could call them a native speaker of that language, albeit that they receive impoverished input? That is, they receive not very much language. Sometimes it's impoverished in the sense that it's flawed, it's got grammatical inaccuracies, and the claim is they receive very little feedback. So how is it possible? And his answer is there must be a universal grammar. The principles and parameter versions of this says that there are innate principles underlying all languages with different parameter settings for each language. So just to give you an example, in English, we have a sentence: the student who's reading a book is happy. We can make it a question by moving the is verb, the be verb, to the front. Is the student who's reading a book happy? But we can't take the be verb out of the relative clause and say, is the student reading a book is happy? The asterisk shows that it's ungrammatical because it violates the principle of structural dependency. Oh my word. I'm so sorry. There we go. So with that assumption, we go to SLA. This is a new computer in case you haven't figured that out. And we see that SLA, second language acquisition researchers, are operating with certain assumptions. The process is universal, it's decontextualized because language is innate. It's a finite rule-governed system. SLA is a process of increasing conformity to a homogeneous target language, referred to as the end state. There are stages along the way that are traversed. It's called an interlanguage, Larry Selinker's term, with each stage being governed by a rule-based grammar. So you start with the L1, the native language, and you have rule-based grammars that learners speak over the course of their traversal of the interlanguage continuum until they reach and acquire the L2, the end state. This is a view of second language development that's been in operation for a long time, although it's not necessarily current, and I'll get to that in a moment. One other one, and I added it as a different point because it's different in the sense that it talks about the learner as opposed to the learning. So it's possible to adopt a two-phase research agenda, concentrating first on understanding learner and later on accounting for learners' differential success. Why is it that certain learners achieve maximum acquisition and others don't? It's been a different strand, but an important one of SLA research. Now, pushing back against this innatist deconceptualized conception of language was connectionism, introduced in an important book, and using neural network models, connectionist neural network models, and feeding it an abundant amount of language, it generates patterns, right? And even generates overgeneralization errors that were not inputted to the system. So it will produce the equivalent of something like, I eated it, which is an overgeneralization error common in L1's children's speech. This rethinking innatist has led to usage-based statistical learning or emergentism views. They're all sort of different flavors of the same theory, where language isn't necessarily seen as a rule-governed system, but rather a set of patterns. They arise because of our brain's capacity to create and recognize patterns. We have this exquisite ability, and children can acquire them, the patterns, because of their capacious memories and the provision of communicative feedback that comes from interaction. Now, some of you may have seen this Deb Roy talk. He's on, you can see Deb Roy talk on, what is it? On, you know what I mean, where you record talks. Anyway, you can go and do that and see what he's done. He's done from his first day of his newborn son's birth till the time he came from the hospital to the age of 3. He collected 200,000 hours of data. Those of us in language don't lack for data. And he put cameras and microphones in the rooms all over the house. Again, you can see this in the talk. And the result is an $8 million word corpus. That's why I say we don't want for words. And then in subsequent search for the birth of a word, different Roy, show that words used in distinctive spatial, temporal, and linguistic contexts are produced earlier, suggesting they are easier to learn. And so here's an example from his talk. This is the layout of the house. And you see the square that's most red there is the kitchen. And it shows you that the word breakfast, it has 313 tokens. And breakfast occurs between the hours of 8 and sort of 11. That's the graph to the right most often. And of course, breakfast occurs most oftenly spoken, the word spoken in the early hours in the kitchen. They're not all so secured that way. A word like beautiful can be spoken throughout the whole layout of the house. Nonetheless, frequency is a prerequisite, but not the primary driver. Children's first words depend on what they care about, and the context modulates children's learning of words. As I said a moment ago, each word has its natural, temporal, contextual, and linguistic distributional distinctiveness. This was from my notes taken of Michael Frank's lecture at Princeton. Of course, there's also reliability of the form-function mapping. It's not just frequency, but frequency certainly can be a primary driver. So you can imagine a big debate ensued between the cognitive innate view of UG and the social contextual view. And I summarized the debate because I really wanted to understand why is this such a big issue? And people were fighting about this. There was a lot of internecine feuding. And so I looked back at the arguments mounted by each side, and I tried to understand and summarize them. And I came up with not just social versus cognitive. Most people accept that there are both, but what's the distribution of concepts or beliefs? And I came up with 12. I won't take you through all of them, but just to give you a little understanding, I'll frame some of them. So looking at on the left is the mainstream cognitive view, or it was then. The right is the social view. What about the role of context? Well, the mainstream cognitive view says, social context is the site in which SLA takes place. However, if you change the context, the acquisition process remains the same. The goal is to search for universals that transcend individual contexts. Whereas the social people say, well, actually, social context is not just a backdrop. It's the determining factor. Social factors are related to systematic variation in learner language. It cannot be claimed that results are generalizable in all contexts. The primary research focus for the cognitive people is how people learn a language, not how they use it. That was a major argument when they came back in a subsequent article in Modern Language Journal to dispute the social factors, social people. They said, we're not interested in how they use a language. We're interested in how they learn it. And the social people said, wait a minute, the primary focus is on language use, but language use and acquisition cannot be easily separated. The progress for the cognitive people is the route towards the target language proficiency, and that's measured by the learner's linguistic performance. I mentioned that with the interlanguage continuum. Social people say, let's look at what the learner does to get his or her message across, and not what the learner cannot do, End state, cognitive people. The end state occurs when learner language and target language congruent, or where learner language is stabilized, or sometimes called fossilized. I can't talk about that right now. It's another lecture. Social, there is no end state, important. And finally, again, skipping all in the in-between, the cognitive people say one theory will prevail, empiricism will determine which, but social people say, no, there are multiple theories are welcome, even necessary. So I was talking a moment ago about words, and now I'm going to look at constructions, look at Adele Goldberg's work here. Construction can be a word with its morphology, but in this case, it's VACs, verb argument constructions. What are the verb arguments that are taken in English? And there are three. The first is a subject verb oblique or path, and it's an intransitive verb. So something like, she went home. The second subject verb object oblique, a transitive verb. She cooked dinner. And the third is a subject verb ditransitive, the subject verb to objects. So she fed the dog dinner, or she gave the dog dinner. Let's do it that way. And so what we see is that in the input to the learners, this is based on Childist, the Brian McWhinney's corpus that he organized or gathered at Carnegie Mellon University. We see that there's a path-breaking verb that occurs with each in what's said to the children by way of the mother's talk. So, and what the children produce themselves. So for the intransitive verb, go is primarily, not exclusively, but primarily used in that construction. Similarly, again, mothers use go, not over 50%, but primarily. That's the verb that receives the most attention. Goldberg suggests that the learning of constructions is optimized by an initial low variance sample centered upon prototypical exemplars. And then this allows learners to get a fix on what accounts for most of the category members. Moving to second language acquisition, in a study done on the European Science Foundation corpus analysis of the VACs, the verb argument construction by ESL learners, by Ellis and Ferreira Jr. They looked at this particular triad, English, the Punjabi and Italian learners learning English over a 30-month period. And they gathered data, the European Science Foundation gathered data by interviews every 4 to 6 weeks. These interviews were then created through all kinds of tasks, free conversation, but also more structured tasks, role plays, film watching, etc. 234 sessions were transcribed of the data using an automatic transcription system. And here's what was learned. The native speaker input, again, 234 sessions, the number of different verbs, over 14,000, the types, that is the individual verbs, 232, native speaker, non-native speaker learner data, parallels it, not the same to the same extent, right? They produce less language, but still the transitive verb is much more commonly used than the intransitive, the transitive, and the ditransitive. Now, if we look at the frequency distribution, we see that with the verb, the intransitive verb, the one where I said she went home, the native speaker input, we see in this bar graph, if you look at the y-axis, you'll see that the verb go, again, accounts for the most tokens, right? The frequency of the verb go overwhelms the other verbs that enter into this construction. And if you do a log analysis, you see that the frequency and the log rank account for a great deal of the variability. And in fact, almost a linear path, which shows a power law, the Zipfian power law. Same thing with the verb object, the transitive verb. Again, put is the most common verb. There are other verbs, but put far and away is the path-breaking verb. And then the same with the plotting it as a log plot. You see the linearity of the learning. So what's the point? You get one very frequent lead exemplar in all cases, one verb that seems to account for the lion's share of the instances. Now, looking at the learner data, you won't be surprised to find that we find the same thing. We can do a log and account for a lot of the variation. Put with that and go or give, except with the ditransitive, one very frequent lead exemplar. So again, it's out of human social interactions that patterns in language emerge. Humans interact, they co-adapt. Co-adaptation is a dynamic process and one that is locally constituted. In order to meet their communicative needs, speakers appropriate, adapt, and create new patterns. So I've been talking about the co-adaptation process. Let me now show you the birth of a word, the creation of new patterns. So here's some data. Lynne Cameron collected this, my co-author, in Norway, in a classroom of 11-year-olds. And yeah, that's probably all you need to know at this point. The teacher is saying to the first student, go back to your memory of the tree that you're trying to draw, because that's tended to look like a lollipop, hasn't it? And you know, from children's renditions, children's drawings, renderings, that you might see that a tree initially depicted as a vertical stick with a circle on top. Looks like a lollipop, but that's the way they characterize trees. That seems to be very common. A couple of seconds later, in a further utterance, the teacher repeats and reformulates, reducing the form from a comparison to a metaphorical phrase. She says, when I was a very young teacher, and I kept on saying to a little girl, you please stop doing lollipop trees. Later, the teacher is saying to a second student, it's lovely, that one. Don't spoil it. The only thing I'm going to criticize is, and students see, the third student who wasn't directly addressed chimes in to complete the sentence and says lollipop trees. So the use of the phrase lollipop trees has stabilized only briefly. That's what a lexical conceptual pact is. They just agree that that's the term they're going to use in this course. We don't know if it's spread across all students. We don't know if it continues beyond this class, but it serves to show the self-organizing processes of discourse at the local level, constrained by the grammatical affordances of the language and driven by the contingencies of the pedagogical or pedagogic interaction. So language use cannot be accommodated within the terms of a fixed language system. I inserted it's an open system. Speakers are continuously modifying the system, combining familiar elements in novel ways and testing existing resources in new environments. But if we only had the innovation, if we only had things like lollipop trees emerging upwards through the local interactions, language would soon spiral to the point where we couldn't have a language that was mutually intelligible. And so Lynne and I made this point that language emerges upwards in the sense that innovative language using patterns arise from individuals using the language interactively, adapting to one another's resources. However, there's reciprocal causality, sometimes it's called circular causality, in that the language using patterns themselves downwardly entrain emergent patterns conventionally to ensure intelligibility. They downwardly entrain them through the hysteresis of the system, through social convention and such. So patterns in SLA are variegated and softly assembled. And the term softly assembled is important because that's a contrast with the hard wiring that comes from an innatist perspective. They're softly assembled, the product of dynamic adaptation to a specific context. They are created and dissolved as tasks and environments change, as our friend Esther Thalen and Elizabeth Pate say. Some patterns are preferred, others are more ephemeral. Some of my own research, I looked at several learners, 5 of them in fact, who wanted a course in English to be taught to them at the University of Michigan. They had come with their partners. Their partners were getting graduate degrees at the university, but these were professional women in all cases themselves, and they wanted to do something useful with their time. They asked if I was the institute director, if I could arrange a course for them, and I had some discretionary income, so I said yes. I hired a teacher. She developed a curriculum, and we went from there. But I asked for them in return, would they allow us to study their language development? And they agreed. And we taped them, we recorded them over a roughly 5-month period, and every 6 weeks asked them to write a story, some story, and write the same story each time. And that's, a bit of a problem, but it's a way to hold some of the data, not constant, but at least similar, so it can be analyzed. And then I divided it into idea units, which mainly consists of a main clause, sometimes subordinate clauses with it, that constitute a unit that can be syntactically or intonationally separated from the rest of the text. And I'm just showing you some of the data, but I wanted to highlight the fact that some of these of the words used, and again, they didn't refer to them. They just had to remember 6 weeks later. They didn't have to remember. They had to recreate the story 6 weeks later. So idea unit 1, this learner says, my husband came in August. In October, my husband went. And then in November, I can't even read that. It's under a thing. Okay, let's leave that one alone. Notice, by the way, in October, November, she's producing more language. Here's another one, written data. She talks about getting married in June, getting married in August, getting married in October. Just marry in November, uses the verb not get married. The same learner in August says many money, then changes to the target language, acceptable form, much money, and persists with much money, although it doesn't always persist. and so forth. So some of them are stable and continued wise oral data because they also gave an oral rendition of the story. Get married, get married, get married, get married. The red I've highlighted for you. Let's see. The second one, many money did switch to much money, and so on. Development, therefore, seems not so much the stage-like progression of new accomplishments as the waxing and waning of patterns, some stable and adaptive and others fleeting and seen only under special conditions. Now, some of the resulting self-organized patterns of action are very stable because of the intrinsically preferred states of the system and the particular situation at hand. Such patterns of thought and action may be thought of as strong attractors in the behavior space. Performance is consistent and not easily perturbed. But other patterns are unstable. They're easily perturbed by small changes in the conditions, and performance with the same participant is highly variable and not dependable. Development then can be envisioned as a changing landscape or preferred, but not obligatory behavioral states with varying degrees of stability and instability, rather than as a prescribed series of structurally invariant stages leading to progressive improvement. Not an interlanguage continuum, in other words. In order to meet our communicative needs, we appropriate, adapt, create new patterns. And the anthropologist Levi-Strauss calls it bricolage, reusing available material to solve new problems. The available material could be from other languages or dialects as well. So it could be through language mixing or what's called language translanguaging these days, code switching. Yeah, of course, there's stability to language too. Conventional patterns arise from social interaction. In, for example, a marriage proposal, you might ask your beloved, will you marry me? You might say, I want to marry you. These are sort of fixed forms, formulaic sequences. They're sometimes called lexicalized stems. They're sometimes called. You probably wouldn't say, I wish to be wedded to you. I desire you to become married to me. No, your marrying me is desired by me. And you're not likely to become successful if you used your proposal as my becoming your spouse is what I want. Now, notice they're all grammatical, but they are not coalesced around one form, one conventional form, a formulaic sequence. By the way, just as an interesting side note, Andy Pauly, the author from whom I got these examples, and Cider, Andy Pauly he's now retired professor at Australian National University in Canberra, where I taught at a Australian Linguistics Institute some years ago. And I knew about this article, but I learned there that Cider was actually his mother. I just thought that was interesting that he co-authored a paper with his mother, who had been an English teacher. So there's a sense in which a system like language is not externally controlled through inputs and outputs, but creates itself together in a self-organizing manner that make it have this individuality and directedness in relationship to the environment. In other words, language is a complex adaptive system. And again, another little side note, that's from a book that Nick Ellis and I co-edited, published in 2009, following an exciting trip we went to. We participated in a symposium at the Complex Systems Institute in Santa Fe, and sort of mecca of complexity theory. Following that symposium, we gathered the authors at that symposium and added a few others and created a conference from which this book is the collection of the papers given. Language as a complex adaptive system is the view of language different from the others the field has adopted. It puts less emphasis on preformationism, the assumption that in order to build a complex structure, you need to begin with a detailed plan or template. It puts less emphasis on that. It foregrounds dynamic emergence. Just to help a little bit, to give you a non-linguistic example, here are 4 landmarks. We have Beijing, of course, the entrance to the Forbidden City, the Brandenburg Gate, Mount Fuji, and I believe that's the Osaka Castle in Japan. And if you look at them, you'll see they're rather fuzzy. And that's not because the photographer had a shaky hand, but rather each one of these is a composite, is an aggregation of a number of different photographs of the same object, the same focus, but they're all taken by different people. So if you stand in Tiananmen Square and look at the gate, the Meridian Gate to the Forbidden City, there's nothing on the pavement of Tiananmen Square, believe me, that says, stand here for the perfect picture of the gate. But we all have that postcard picture in our minds, and we all stand maybe a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, a little bit forward, a little backwards. And the result is of a number of photographs that Corinne Duyonnet collected. We get this composite. It's a little blurry because we don't all see it the same way. And yet the image emerges from exemplars. I hope that's helpful in the same way that we all use language a little bit differently, but patterns emerge from our social interaction. I hope that's a useful illustration. From a complex dynamic systems theory perspective, language development is no longer seen as a process of acquiring abstract rules which then get applied, but as the emergence of language abilities in real time. It's a sociocognitive process. And of course, I use sociocognitive as one word because of the importance the complexity theory gives to relationships and connections. So this view of language tends to portray does not portray learner language as being incomplete and deficient. Indeed, we understand language as a self-modifying emerging system in that the developmental change process is never complete, and neither is its learning. In 2006, I wrote an article that I entitled "There's No End and There Is No State." And I suggested we call the field SLD, second language development, not second language acquisition. Can't say I've been all that successful because so much of the literature has been written with SLA, but the University of Pennsylvania, when I taught there, I taught a course, allowed me to call it second language development, not second language acquisition. So we're making some strides. Certainly not the case that we do this one language at a time independently, keeping them separate, right? And Herdina and Yesner talk about how we can't talk about the development of multilingualism in the sense of having a linear projection from endpoint measures. There's a considerable fluctuation and variation with respect to multilingualism language systems wax and wane. Another important part of the research landscape, I alluded to this earlier, was the bifurcation, the difference between looking at learning as a process versus learners as agents of the process. Now, originally, there were only 4 individual differences talked about: motivation, attitude, psychological, and social distance. Just 15 years later, 84 in Bernard Smolsky's book, The Conditions, were talked about. And now hundreds and hundreds of more individual differences have been discussed and studied. And here's some research that I did again on those learners. We see 4 graphs here looking at over time, over the course of the study, accuracy, the growth in accuracy, the growth in fluency, the growth in vocabulary complexity, and the growth in grammatical complexity. And aside from a dip in August, we all dip in August, I think, we see a relatively straight linear progression in terms of the development over the course of the 5 months and the study. However, if we go one level down in granularity, we see a great deal of inter-individual variation on these 4 indices and a great deal of intra individual variation as well. So new research, well, it was new then, on micro development shows that variability is one of the most consistent attributes of developmental processes. In fact, it's the potential driving force of development, variability. Just to show you another advantage, another one, research, you looking at Chinese learners analyzed using dynamic analyses, moving min-max graphs, moving correlations, Monte Carlo simulations. The principle of equifinality, systems are multidimensional, and there are multiple ways that a system can evolve, and the same outcome can be achieved through many different starting points and paths, such as learner L, in this case, focusing more on vocabulary complexity, others grammatical complexity. Learner U, in this case, focusing much more on grammatical complexity. Learner L, much more on fluency. So there are different ways to achieve the same end. Now, most recently, like this summer, I was invited to participate in something called the Open Theory Series. It was organized by Cesar Quena Ramos, and I mention it because it is available on YouTube. I was interviewed for a couple of hours, actually, on complex dynamic systems theory. And he started out by saying he thinks that CDST is misunderstood. There are a lot of misconceptions. And he went on to list them. This is just a screenshot from the presentation this summer. He said, these are a lot of misconceptions. And so he invited me to try to dispel them. And I did, or I tried. So I'm going to take 3 of them just very quickly and show you what my counter arguments are. Misconception 1, it's just a metaphor. And the eminent biologist Richard Lewontin says, it's not possible to do the work of science without using a language that's filled with metaphor. And Esther Thalen, all theories are metaphoric. We wrote that metaphors give us a way to think. However, it's true that a lot of the CDST research was exploratory and not falsificatory, not confirmatory in nature. And so we do need to do more research beyond the metaphors. And the scoping review of research gives a full rendition of what has happened up to this point in time. And they talk about the themes that have emerged from this approach to understanding language learning. Misconception 2, it's a quantitative theory. That was one of the ones on the screenshot I showed you. Well, that is a misconception because there are 2 kinds of complexities, according to Edgar Morin, the educational philosopher. Restrictive French philosopher. Restricted complexity involves a strict mathematical application of complexity, and sometimes it's confusingly called dynamical systems theory. Whereas general complexity, which CDST researchers follow, has operated ontologically and epistemologically differently. It's largely inspired by the complex means through which nature regenerates and maintains order under constant changing conditions. That's human, not human. I guess now we're going to have to start to give our citations as AI or human, but this is human's, a quote from Human. So CDST researchers do quantify phenomena. However, they recognize that quantifying a phenomena does not make it objective reality. Numbers need interpretation, and researchers need to be strategic in how they quantify phenomena. And I've already given you some examples. There are innovative quantitative methods that have been devised by researchers: min-max graphs, power laws, Siphian distribution, fractals. I gave a talk on language as a fractal. And so we have research. We have 2 research books now that have a number of different methods of doing research in the name of complexity theory and applied linguistics. The one on the left by Hiver and Alhuri in 2020, and a new one that hasn't even come out yet. I only have, this is the front and the back cover. I only have access to it because I wrote the prologue, but Research Methods in Complex Dynamic Systems Theory to Approaches to Second Language Development. So we have more and more available research methods that will help us move beyond metaphor. Misconception 3, it has nothing to do with pedagogy. This really hurts since I've written a book on how it does. But just to give you an idea of what was going on in the field, for a long time, the view of pedagogy was the learners would get input. The mind is a black box. Something would happen with this input as long as it was comprehensible. As long as it was comprehensible, they could understand it, and it was at a level that they could take it in, and they could produce output. So input, mind is black box, output, clearly a computer metaphor. But I've written that the input is problematic. It dehumanizes the learner. It overlooks the learner's agency. It views him or her as a computer, because it's appropriate when it was coined, right? It was a computer age. However, and it has real drawbacks, as I say, it dehumanizes the learner. You see, the learner's brain is a black box. It necessitates all manner of terminological qualifications in terms of intake, uptake, and output. It downplays or even overlooks the meaning-making nature of language, and it problematizes the deep-seated assumption that learning is a matter of assembling an internal model of an external reality. Teaching doesn't cause learning. Learners make their own paths, and this way, learning another language is not about conformity to uniformity. Nevertheless, there is a normative dimension to teaching, but learning is not a two-step process. It's not that we develop a mental grammar or competence through exposure to comprehensible input, and then we convert it to output through practice. That's a dominant view, but it's not the case. Instead, I think from a complexity theory perspective, we should teach with iteration, not repetition. We should teach adaptation, teach students to take the bit of language they have, however meager it is, and adapt it to new situations, thereby making it more functionally developed. So to go from hi to hello, good morning, good evening, in other words, adapting greetings to different situations, taking what they have and asking them to, or helping them to mold it to new situations or more functionality. Teach with students L1 is a resource. Think of bricolage. So use it as a resource rather than an impediment, rather than as a source of errors. Teach differentially. It's often talked about teachers have to teach differentially. That puts an awful burden on the teacher. I prefer thinking of personalized learning, where the learners themselves can differentiate what it is they learn, what they're interested in. An example would be project-based learning, where learners adopt different projects and carry them out and report on them and all kinds of things, where they themselves are invested in the topic. A self-assessed language, self-referentially. Don't look at as a comparison to native speaker use, look at it as what they can do that they couldn't do the last time, self-referentially. What is it they can do now they couldn't do before? And identify affordances. Affordances simply is an opportunity to learn, and to try to do that for learners. How can we look for those opportunities where learning is likely to take place? And here again is some data from my study, but it's one learner with both written data and oral data. And you'll see that over the course of the study, she uses the preposition in June, in her written data, at in the oral data, and August written data. So it goes in, at, in the written data, and the oral data goes at, in, at. So even in the same period of time, the prepositions are not the same. Why is that? Well, Chinese doesn't make, she's a Chinese speaker, Chinese doesn't make a distinction between in and at. And I would say this provides an opportunity and affordance to zero in on and help through a contrastive process the learner to see and maybe learn that feature. I said in my abstract that there was a personal connection to what I was, to this theory. I actually first gave my talk on it in 1994 in Montreal at the Second Language Research Forum, and that later was published in 1997. Because I had been teaching language for a long time, and I confronted, as many teachers do, what Alfred North Whitehead called in 1929 the inert knowledge problem, that we can get students to do what we're teaching. They can take it on during the lesson, but when they return, it seems to be AWOL, right? It's inert. It's not active. They haven't taken it on, they can't use it. And that was very frustrating. My students could know all the rules of the grammar of the language I was teaching all over the world, but they couldn't use it for their own purposes. And then I came across James Blake's book. It's a nice story of how I came across it, but I'll skip it for now. His book, Chaos, The Making of a New Science. And there on page 24, he wrote, "The act of playing the game as a way of changing the rules." Now, Blake was not writing about linguistic rules. In fact, there's very little in the book has anything to do with language. But that particular sentence on page 24 really hit me, because I said, oh, of course, I'm teaching rules, but really what I need to do is have my students play the language game. They need to use the language. And of course, that's the only way that language changes anyway, is through its use, right? And I went back, remember earlier I said the social view was that acquisition, excuse me, acquisition and use are the same processes, basically. In other words, think of language as a dynamic system rather than a rule-bound, rule-governed static system. And I coined the term grammaring, teaching language, my book, Teaching Language from Language to Grammaring, which you heard about in the introduction. I was also asked to talk about future directions of CDST research in the field of SLA should aim to develop specific hypotheses about the processes of change, as in investigating the randomness or the patterness of inter-individual variability. Should be aimed at testing whether certain patterns of intra-individual variability are associated with more or less optimal long-term outcomes. Describing developmental trends and language emergence. Testing temporal relations between different language variables or between speakers. Developing and applying new methodological tools. And I've already given you 2 books recently in 2020 and forthcoming, I think it'll be 2026, books that contains methodologies that are compatible with complex dynamic systems theory. So we're on the way, but we need more, and we need more partly because of yet another misconception that's been published and talked about recently in the literature. And that's the conception that CDST is anti-reductionist. Let me back up just one second and give you the story. What they're saying is we're anti-reductionist because in order to study a complex system, you have to reduce it. There's too much. Everything is interconnected. Everything's changing. How can you possibly take in the whole? So you have to reduce the complex system in order to make it manageable to study. And then they're saying CDST is anti-reductionist because we don't want to reduce the system, right? We want to look at the whole. It's a holistic view. Well, they've ignored what Paul Sayers has written about. They've ignored what I've written about in the name of the boundary problem. How do you bind a system so you can look at it, just the whole at the same time looking at part of it? And I've written about that. They misunderstand reductionism though, primarily because in CDST, it is from the components and their relationship that the system we're trying to understand emerges. If we isolate components of the system artificially, we lose the essence of the phenomenon we are attempting to describe. This is a form of reductionism, that if we reduce it, it's ontological reductionism, and that's the kind of reductionism that CDS pushes against. In CDST, attention shifts from parts to the interaction and relationships of the parts within the system. We cannot cut them apart. We cannot cut them away one by one and think that we can then cumulatively account for a complex system like language. So what I'm saying is they have the wrong idea of reductionism. And the measure of success in the physical sense is to be able to make simple causal statements to reduce them at the lowest possible level. For some things, like the search for the Higgs boson particle, it works to attribute a consequence to a single cause. But as Byrne and Callahan's write, it cannot stand as an approach to the whole of reality. It's obvious that we will require a new mode of thinking. What current processes of globalization and global warming are bringing forth is a need to develop new means which can better understand the complexity of the world around us, which is not reducible to some central or a single essence. I think that's the story of complexity theory today. This book that just came out this year, Global Crises, Complexity-Based Research and Practice for Social Transformation by David Byrne, Jill Kelligan, and Emma Lepridger, I can recommend. The first chapter has a lot about complexity theory. The rest of the book, the other chapters, talk about the application of it to different parts of governance in the UK. But I think we need to think about this, if I may make a political statement, beyond language and beyond our classroom interests, to think about it in dealing with global crises, because I think it will help us. Maybe not save us, but help us. Thank you for listening.
All right, thank you, Diane, for that wonderful presentation. I think we might have time really quickly for one question. All right, it took me a minute to get my screen share up. All right, well, I'll go ahead with our announcements really quick if no one has any questions. Once again, thank you for presenting today. I really appreciated, and I took note of your description or illustration of emergence. Sometimes I have difficulty like discussing or like portraying what complex systems is and like some of the theoretical tenets. And I really liked the images of all of the monuments. Sorry, lack of a better word. All right. So thank you once again. And I'd quickly like to plug our next webinar series. We have Sarah Wolf, who will be discussing modeling complexity and motivation, a within-person approach with LAG1 graphical vector autoaggressions. And we will begin the rest or continue the rest of our series in February, for February and March, with our last two presentations. And very quickly, I would like to also mention the Sprint Mentorship Program. Applications are coming soon due. So this is a wonderful opportunity for graduate students to work with complexity scholars. The program will start in January and run through up until AERA, and you will, if graduate students will present an ongoing or a work in progress poster at our business meeting. And then the next year, they'll be able to present that finished work, hopefully within the SIG. And yeah, that's all that I have for today. So thank you all for joining, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Oh, and Elvin put in the newsletter.